So I think we're all quite familiar with the problem of plastic pollutions, but what we may not be familiar with is the idea that bacteria might be the solution to this plastic pollution problem. Stick around for another episode of Short Stories Bacteria. Hey everyone, welcome back to another episode of Short Stories of Bacteria, where we talk all about the lives of the tiny and the infamous, the incredible and amazing bacteria. I, as always, am your host, Dr. K, and I'm here to guide you through yet another really cool story about bacteria. But before we jump into that, if this is your first time, or if this is your second time or third time, don't forget to hit that follow button. Don't forget to hit that subscribe button. Don't forget to hit that share button. Don't forget to leave us a 5-star review. All these things are really useful for keeping the podcast, for keeping the channel going. So thank you so much for showing up. But enough of that. Let us jump into the story for today. So today what we're talking about plastics. Now, I think everyone is very familiar with all the PSAs surrounding plastics. Plastics are bad for the environment. Microplastics are possibly bad for human health. There's a whole bunch of issues around plastics, which is kind of sucky because actually plastics, when they were first envisioned, when they first kind of splashed onto the scene, they were actually really useful ways of replacing unsustainable materials. So at around the end of the 19th century and the start of the 20th century, there were a whole bunch of issues with unsustainable materials. So things like piano keys, things like billiard balls, there were things like ivory, things like glass were being used that are either really fragile or they would break down really rapidly, or in the case of something like ivory, they were elephants, rhinoceri who were being hunted essentially to extinction as a way of getting this ivory. So there were a whole bunch of issues with unsustainable materials. Now, what plastics did is, because plastics are super stable, because plastics are they're really cheap, they're really easy to make, and since they're super flexible, these were able to replace these unsustainable, easy to break types of materials. Now, the first plastics that initially splashed on the scene came from a gentleman by the name of Alexander Parks. He made something called Parkazine. There was another gentleman, the father of modern plastics, so-called, named Leo Baekeland. He made something called Bakelite. And what's actually really interesting is that Bakelite when Baekeland was making his plastic, he initially was trying to replace something like varnish or something along these lines. And then he ended up making plastic almost on accident. So that's really cool. But I guess at the end of the day, the point that I want to make is that even though plastics now are causing a whole bunch of issues, when plastics were initially built, they were really good replacements for unsustainable materials. So that's awesome. The downside, of course, is that because plastics are super cheap, because they're super easy to make, we as humans made a whole bunch of different plastics, and we use a whole bunch of plastics every year now, something to the tune of, I think it's north of 430 million tons of plastics are being used every single year by humans. And the vast majority of these are actually single-use plastics. So we use them once and then we toss them out. Now, all of that tossed out plastic starts to build up. We're all familiar with this. And you maybe have heard of we're releasing something like 13 million metric tons of plastics into the ocean every single year. The presence of the plastics in these oceans, first of all, they're occupying a lot of space. Second of all, they're endangering a whole bunch of different types of animals. I think the UN said 800 different animals are endangered as a result purely of just the plastics that we're releasing into the ocean. The other downside is, in addition to there just being a whole lot of it, the plastics, I mentioned a second ago that they're really stable, they're really durable, and it's hard to break them down. Plastics by themselves don't degrade well over time. I think just the basic plastics, takes 1,000 years for it to degrade. And there are some plastics that last tens of thousands of years before they fully degrade. So we're dealing with this issue of tons of plastic in the environment and not a good way of breaking it down. Now, a existential tough question that scientists are trying to ask right now is, how do we get rid of these plastics? There's the idea of just recycling the plastics. That's a great idea. But there's another idea that a lot of folks are having, which is, how do we go about breaking down these plastics in such a way that it's not going to damage the environment, or some kind of environmentally sustainable way? Now, some people are like, well, let's just not try and break down the plastics at all. Let's just gather it up into a little ball and then shoot it out into orbit. That's one option. But again, a lot of scientists are like, okay, there has to be a more sustainable way. Now, there's a group of researchers that published a paper recently, and they're out of the Nanyang Technological University in Singapore. They published this really, really cool paper as a way of dealing with this plastic problem. Now, what they did is they were looking at this particular worm called Zoophobus atratus. Zoophobus atratus, that's the name of the worm. Now, the worm is actually a larvae for a type of beetle. But what the researchers found out is they were like, wow, this beetle larvae, also known as a superworm, is able to digest and break down plastics. It's able to digest, break down plastics. Now, the researchers were really excited about this because they're like, oh, if we can just then scale up the amount of superworms out there, then we can break down all these plastics and we don't have to shoot off plastics in orbit, and then we don't have to wait for it for 10,000 years for it to degrade, right? That's the game plan. Now, the problem with this is that each of these individual worms is really tiny, right? Zoophobus atratus, the superworm, it only digests something like a couple milligrams of plastic in its entire lifetime, right? That's not a whole lot of milligrams, as it turns out. And if you will recall, we're producing 430 million tons of plastic. So you would need, I think someone did the math on this, it's more than 10 or 1 times 10 to the 17th power amount of superworms if you want to digest the plastics that we're producing. Now, that doesn't seem like a huge number to you, but that's enough to envelop the world multiple times. And the vast majority of people, I think, don't want to be overrun by superworms by any stretch. So the researchers are like, okay, so assuming that we don't want to be overrun by superworms, we have to have a way of enriching and making this a little bit more efficient, this breakdown of plastics. Now, what the researchers figured out is as they were looking at these worms, they found out that it wasn't actually the worms themselves that were breaking down the plastics, but instead it was a bunch of bacteria in the gut of the worms. These bacteria were digesting the plastic and breaking it down. And so the researchers were like, okay, if there's a way, it'd be really, really cool if there was a way for us to scale up these bacteria and then take that enriched amount of bacteria and use that on plastics instead of relying on 1 times 10 to the 17th power superbugs, right? So that was the game plan. Now, the way the researchers did this was actually pretty neat. So what they did is they took these superworms, and then they incubated them with a whole bunch of plastics. And then they started digesting the plastics, the bacteria in the gut of these worms started digesting the plastics. And then as they kept breaking down the plastics, what that's doing is that's enriching for these plastic digesting bacteria in the gut of the worms. And so then what the researchers did is after the superworms had finished their meal of plastics, they reached into the gut of the superworms, grabbed those bacteria, pulled them out, and then scaled them up in a culture. So now those plastic digesting bacteria that were once in the gut of the worms are now in a really, really big culture, tons and tons of bacteria all hanging out. Then what the researchers did is they made what they called a synthetic worm gut. They basically made an enormous tube, right, that mimicked a worm gut, and then they stuffed it full of these plastic digesting bacteria. And that worm gut, that synthetic worm gut that's chock full of all these plastic digesting bacteria, was able to break down plastic at a larger scale, right? And so what this signifies is that there's a technology that's emerging right now that takes bacteria out of the plastic digesting superworm, and then you can just run plastics through that and in an environmentally sustainable way break that stuff down. So let's put a bow on this. Let's go step by step. First of all, plastic is a really big issue. We generate a whole bunch of plastic every year. Number 2, there are some bugs called superworms that are able to, based off of the bacteria that are in their gut, break down plastics. Number 3, there's a group of researchers out in Singapore, and what they did is they extracted that plastic digesting bacteria and placed it in a synthetic worm gut. And number 4, that synthetic worm gut was able to break down plastic at a larger scale. It's a really, really cool instance of how not only how different types of worms and bugs are able to utilize bacteria as a way of doing kind of bizarre things, but it's a really neat technology that could in the future be used as a way of breaking down plastics in a much more environmentally sustainable way. But anyway, guys, that is all I have time for. That is all I have time for today. Thank you so much for tuning in. Thank you so much for watching. And I hope you guys will join me again on another episode of Short Stories Bacteria. Hey everyone, thanks for watching that video. Hope you guys enjoyed it. If you liked what you saw, don't forget to hit that like, share, subscribe button, and I will hopefully see you guys in the next video. Later!